I'm delighted to have a chance to talk to you about my interests and a little bit of my research. A little bit of background. A couple of years ago, I don't think I would have envisioned myself speaking to a group like this. I blame one particular individual who's here by the name of Howard Chambers. You'll hear more about Howard's work tomorrow, but I met her at the BMW Guggenheim lab that Laetitia referred to, and she told me that she was doing this design project on sidewalk sheds. And I said, sidewalk sheds, what are those? And she explained what they were to me, these coverings over sidewalks at construction sites. And I walked away thinking, that's an interesting niche interest. At first I didn't get it. And then over the course of the next couple of days walking around in New York City, I got it. The place is filled with them. And since that time, as I've walked through major cities, I've realized what important issues are involved in understanding our responses to construction sites in cities. I'm a psychologist, so what that means to me is that my focus is on trying to look inside individuals at a very fine-grained level. So what's going on inside the minds of a pedestrian as they walk past a construction site. And so what I thought I'd do is to begin by describing to you at a fairly reductionist level what kinds of things are happening to you as you basically walk anywhere through any city street, and then slowly zero in, but also build back up to the whole human level. And I'm also going to present you with, I'm a little bit humbled by the things that I've seen this morning, but I'm going to present you with a very modest case study of a design that I had nothing to do with. I basically stumbled across it after the fact. But I think that it shows in some dramatic ways the impact that a construction site can have on individual human behavior. So, to begin at the beginning, I wanted to say just a few things about the senses. First of all, we heard towards the end of the last session some discussion about the roles of senses other than vision. But what is really true of human beings, some might argue with this, I suppose, but we are preponderantly visual. More than half of our brains are devoted to the processing of visual information. So everything that I'm going to say today focuses on the visual sense and the impact of construction sites and other kinds of things on the visual sense. So to consider vision at a neuroscientific level, one of the first things to think about is actually how we see. And I'm not going to tell you everything about how we see, don't worry, but there's a distinction that I think is important. And it begins with the fovea. The fovea is a very small region of your retina. It actually subtends about 5 degrees of visual space. If you want to get a sense for what that means, if you hold 2 thumbs together at arm's length, then that subtends the size of your fovea. And the fovea is the only place in the eye where color lives. It's the only place in the eye where you have good detailed vision. So as you're walking down a city street, what's happening is that you're getting a series of successive and really very brief snapshots of the world through this tiny 5-degree window for all detailed vision and color. Each of those snapshots lasting about 1/4 of a second. So it depends on exactly what you're doing, but for walking through an urban scene, you're having about 4 fixations per second with very rapid movements between those fixations. So it certainly doesn't feel as though that's what's happening when you're walking down a street. It feels as though you have this kind of panoramic sense of being there, being immersed in a setting. But that's all kind of artifactual. That's something that's built or constructed by your brain after the fact. Your brain seamlessly stitches together those snapshots of the world. The other part of your visual system, of course, you've got more than a fovea, you've got a periphery. The periphery is doing other kinds of things for you. It's helping you with things like stability. It's helping you with things like guidance of movements, tasks like avoiding obstacles, avoiding crashing into somebody who walks past you on the sidewalk, and to some extent also guiding those fixations, guiding where you look next. So you've got these 2 systems that are kind of working in tandem. And again, all of this below the level of awareness. You don't know that all of this is going on. In fact, if you try to focus on it and focus and attend to these kinds of processes, you really can't. Your brain does a very handy job of stitching everything together. So that's the purely sensory part of what's happening as you walk down a city street. Of course, you've got other layers as well. So everybody knows, for example, that there's an important role for memory and emotion in your experience of an urban setting. As you're walking down a street, you are constantly taking that sensory input and trying to develop a story. Human beings are not only preponderantly visual, but preponderantly built to respond to narrative. So as we're walking the street, we are building up for ourselves a set of ideas, the story, based in part on what we see and based in part on what we already know, what we remember. At the same time, at the emotional level, and these are other parts of the brains now, areas like the limbic system, are involved in developing emotional responses to the places that we walk through. And those emotional responses can come from all kinds of different places. They can come from, again, from associations, things that we remember about the setting that we're in. They can also be really much more primal than that. We actually are built with a set of mechanisms that cause us to be attracted to some things, repelled by other things, to be aroused, to be bored by certain kinds of settings. And these primal mechanisms are there because for our evolutionary forebears, having those kinds of innate attractions and repulsions to places could have meant the difference between life and death. For us, not necessarily the case, but those kinds of systems are still there, and they still exert their effects on you when you're walking down a street or when you're walking basically anywhere. What I'd like to do now is tell you a little bit about the experimental work, our experimental approach. First of all, we do something that I call street psychology, and that is unlike the case with most experimental psychology, where we take typically first-year undergraduate students in universities and sit them in dark rooms and laboratories and test them. I like to take things into the real world, because if things don't work in the real world, then they don't work, they don't mean anything. But that, in lots of ways, is a much harder kind of thing to do. The way that I do it is to take people on walks and to equip them in various ways with a toolkit that allows them to tell me what's happening to them, and also allows me to measure for myself directly some of the physiological variables that are at play as they're walking around in a city. So the kinds of things that we do range from the kind of thing that you see here, which was an experiment in New York in which we had people equipped with smartphones that asked them questions at particular times and asked them to complete tasks. And the interest was in relating their responses to the places in which they found themselves. We can do other kinds of things as well, everything from measuring eye movements to measuring brain waves and measuring a value that I'll talk a bit more about called skin conductance. And skin conductance is a measure, it's essentially a measure of your sweat gland responses. At this moment, mine will be sort of off the scale. And they give you kind of a rough and ready index of your level of physiological arousal. It can be good, it can be bad. As we all know, sometimes arousal is really good. At other times, not so much. But we can index that with a nice wrist-worn sensor like a wristwatch. So among the things that we found, here's where I want to skip forward for a second. We've been really interested in looking at facades. What we know is that when people are walking down a street, the area around eye level is the most important. So think of something like the bottom 3 to 4 meters, from ground to about 3 to 4 meters up. That's where we're paying most of our attention. That's where that pretty dance of eye movements is taking place. That's where we're doing a lot of the processing. So we've been looking at, for example, the effect of different kinds of facade complexity. And on the slide that you're looking at here, you see a couple of examples of very low complexity facades. And What we've learned about these low complexity facades, you may not be that surprised to discover, is that people don't like them very much. And not only do they not like them very much, so that means that if we measure their mood is low. Not only do they not like them very much, they're characterized by low levels of arousal. They're characterized by other overt behaviors, like people walk faster past these kinds of blank, low complexity facades than they do in other places. People don't stop. If they do stop, if they have to stop at a traffic light, for example, you can almost read out the ennui on their bodies. They just kind of stand with a drooped posture, like an avatar in a game that's not doing anything, just kind of idling, waiting for the next thing to happen. In contrast, higher complexity facades like the ones that I'm showing on this slide make people much happier. People are much more likely to pause, look around, do other stuff. Their arousal levels tend to be higher than is otherwise the case. All of that said, what's also important to recognize is that there's kind of a sweet spot for complexity. You can go too big with complexity. You can overwhelm people. You can put them into a chaotic setting where, interestingly enough, you see the same kinds of responses that you see with low complexity settings. People turn inwards. They tune out the environment. So those are some words. Here's a picture. Now, how do I go back? There we go. Here's a picture. This is an overhead view of a route for a walk that we took people on in New York City. It's in the Lower East Side. And so in addition to the map, you can see this blue contour. And the blue contour actually represents the averaged arousal values of a group of walkers measured from these bracelets that I was describing to you. So what's interesting to notice about this, first of all, is that we know that these arousal levels wax and wane. So again, as you're walking down a street through a neighborhood, you may not necessarily be overtly aware of these things happening to your bodies, but they are. And these are average values, which means that these are aggregate responses of a group. There are things in these settings that are causing these values to rise and fall. Some kinds of things are obvious. If you have people cross a busy street, their arousal values skyrocket, and they should, because we don't want to be dozing half asleep when we're crossing a busy street. It's adaptive to be aroused and alert. But in other cases, things like facade complexity, things like urban green space, for example, that's a big one, have a profound impact on our levels of arousal. And using the kinds of tools that I've described to you, we can actually measure some of those kinds of things. I want to go on to talk about a case study that we did. Again, Letitia said that it would be really good if we could actually do something, bring some data of some kind. So we set out to do that. And the beginning of the process for me was to make a few cold calls to construction companies in Toronto and in Waterloo, where I live, and to explain to them that what I wanted to do is some kind of observational study of a construction site. And I asked them the first question, what kinds of considerations go into designing a construction site? And they said, well, basically we follow the code so that the construction site is safe, and we use the site to provide some surfaces for advertising the companies, the subcontractors, and maybe sometimes some information about what the site is about. And so after a few of these phone calls, I was a little bit discouraged, and I thought this is going to make a fairly uninteresting case study if this is all I can find. Then one day, I was out, quite honestly, I was out looking for good waffles. I'd heard rumor of a great waffle place in Toronto. And on the way to the waffle place, I stumbled across this, which literally stopped me in my tracks. And that turns out, remember that, because that turns out to be pretty important. I had no idea what this was, but somebody had taken the trouble to put some plywood designs on top of, as you can see, a chain link fence with some attractive barbed wire at the top. And so I did a little bit of digging and discovered that what this site actually was the former location of a streetcar roundhouse in Toronto that had been torn down for a redesign. And after being torn down, it was discovered that the ground was permeated with perchloroethylene, which is not very friendly stuff, and you can't build on perchloroethylene. So somebody had to clean it up, and nobody would take responsibility. And a lawsuit ensued, and that was 4 years ago, and it's still going on. Nothing is happening with the site. So the Transit Commission in Toronto said, we can't just leave this field of poison gravel in the middle of the city. It's quite large. We've got to do something. So they held a design competition to do something with the fence. And the design competition was actually won by a pair of artists named, and I'm nervous, so I'm blocking on the names, Scott Younson and Marianne Lovink. And I went to talk to Younson about the design, and he said, well, what we did basically, it was low tech, the design itself, but we went to the neighborhood, we looked around, we talked to people, we understood what was happening in the setting, and then we built the designs and we put them on the fence. So here, for example, on this slide, you see some nice vegetation. Here's another slide, another image of the fence which shows some construction. And what they did in a really clever way was to sort of take a slice through history of the area surrounding the site by representing buildings that used to be on this site and buildings that still were. So you could sight through the fence and you could actually get some kind of resonance between the past and the present. Nothing yet about the future, but the past and the present. We found birds, and I thought, oh, birds, that's cool. But it turns out that the reason that the birds are there is because there are two neighbors living down the street who have this habit of feeding pigeons, and they kind of compete. So both of their roofs are covered with pigeons, and there are just swarms and swarms of them. So this was represented on the fence. They did other things like whimsically representing the lineups of people waiting for the bus at the bus stop on the fence. So all of these things were there. It was just this beautiful combination of things that were kind of primarily aesthetic. Vegetation, for example, there's a long history of research in psychology that shows that when people look at images of nature, even quite stylized images of nature like the ones that you see on the fence, they respond with nice relaxation responses. They feel good. They did that, but at the same time, they had this beautiful transparency. You could see into the site, as well as seeing what was on the fence. You could compare the two. You could get this kind of view through history. Essentially, what they'd done with this fence was to connect the neighborhood with the site, which again, considering that what I'm talking about here is a poison, empty field of gravel, is pretty remarkable. So we decided that we had our site to do a little study, and that's what we did. We needed a control site. This is our control site. This is just a chain link fence not too far away from the Younson and Lovink fence in front of condos that are being built. And as you can see, there's not really very much there other than a little bit of advertising. And we did a straight observational study, which would normally be the first step in a longer process, and it's all I have to report to you today. But the idea basically is to plant observers on the site and to carefully watch what people do. And what we watched was for head turns. Every time somebody walking past the fence turned their head, we recorded the head turn, whether it was towards the road or towards the fence. We recorded pauses, and we got a measure of the speed with which people walked by finding the halfway point of the fence and measuring the elapsed time to walk to the middle, and then the elapsed time to walk to the end of the fence. And I'll show you some data quickly in 1 minute. Here's the head turn data. So the way to read this is the control fence is on the left, the design fence, the Younson and Lovink fence is on the right, and you can see here that lo and behold we got more head turns towards the fence at the design site. I haven't actually told Younson and Lovink about this yet, because when I told them about the study, they said, nobody looks at the fence anymore. It's been there for years. They're just oblivious. Well, it turns out that they are actually turning their heads a little bit more towards the fence. As it turns out, they're also pausing more in front of the design fence than they are in front of the control fence. So that was nice, but the really dramatic finding came from the measurements of people's walking speeds. On average, in an urban setting, the rule of thumb we normally use is that people walk at a rate of about 5 kilometers an hour. So that's what we expected to see. And here's what we saw. In the control fence on the left, you can see that people walked at around 5 kilometers an hour, a little bit of variability depending on the time of day, a little bit of afternoon and evening strolling effect, but by and large 5 kilometers an hour. For the design fence, people walked at about 5 kilometers an hour going in towards the fence, and that's walking in either direction, from the north or from the south. And for the second half of their walk, their speed has slowed to half, which I find extraordinary. When I saw the numbers, I literally couldn't believe that the difference could be that big. But everything has been double-checked and triple-checked, and this effect is actually there. So this fence that's been there for years and years, that has all of these marvelous properties, these aesthetic properties, the connection with the community, is causing a really profound impact on people's behavior as they walk past this fence. We don't know yet what they're doing, why they're slowing down, what's going on in their heads. We can figure some of that out eventually, but for now, we know that this fence, at this humble little setting, compared to some of the things that we heard about this morning, is having this huge impact on people's behavior. So if you can do it on a fence around a field of poison gravel, then surely you can do it pretty much anywhere. Thank you.